Great. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Dion Filmer. I'm the director of the Development Economics Research Group at the World Bank. I want to welcome you all to this 8th edition of the Urbanization Conference, jointly organized this year by the World Bank, George Washington University, International Growth Center, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and you'll be seeing people from these different groupings throughout the day. We're going to kick this off with a bit of a risky proposition, which is we're going to play a video from my boss, the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, Indermit Gill. I say risky because when you play these kinds of videos, there's always something that could go wrong, and starting the day with that is a risk. So here we go, Indermit.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to all of you in the room and those connected online to the 8th edition of the Urbanization Conference. So I want to start by thanking our long-standing partners of this conference, that's George Washington University and the International Growth Center, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who joined the team for this year's edition. We could not do this without our partners. So I would also like to thank the many participants who have traveled a long way to be here, including the mayor from Freetown and other distinguished policymakers from Jordan, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, and the many researchers in the room. We are absolutely honored by your presence. So it has been a decade since we started this conference, and we've come a long way. When we first had the first edition in 2013, there were only a handful of urban economists who were seriously studying urbanization in developing countries. This is not the case anymore. This is in part due to the greater availability of data and methodological advances in the field, and it is in part due to conferences like this one. But I believe that the most important reason is simply that what happens in cities matters a lot, and this will be even more so in the future. Since the Industrial Revolution, cities have been the main engines of growth. This will become even more so. So today, more than 55% of the world's population is urban, and more than 75% of global GDP comes from cities, and these ratios will grow in the future. So marvelous things can happen with urban growth. So as cities increase in number and size, they facilitate better standards of living, they have made human capital and innovation possible, and this will continue. Cities are the central players in the process of economic development. This was true in the past, and it will be even more so the case in the future. Now, on the flip side, many new problems have emerged. In some parts of the world, like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, cities are growing fast. By 2050, the world's urban population is expected to double. In Sub-Saharan Africa alone, the urban population is projected to increase by an additional 800 to 900 million people by 2050. This is almost a threefold increase in just over 3 decades. It is as if we were adding to the cities of the region the populations of the EU and the US put together. So the pace and scale of this phenomenon will cause major strains on land and natural resources as massive amounts of land are being converted to urban use. This is often happening in countries where most people do not have secure property rights. This is a recipe for disorder. It is estimated that 40% of urban growth takes place in slum-like conditions with poor hygiene and high crime rates. This is a recipe for trouble. Now, fast urban growth also exerts strains on infrastructure, leading both to pollution and to congestion. And this is a recipe for squalor. With 75% of global CO2 emissions coming from cities, the rise in urban populations can exacerbate climate change. In turn, urban populations are increasingly exposed to climatic risks, from heat islands to floods, which are disproportionately borne by poor people. This can be a recipe for disaster. Now, this said, there is a large diversity of situations. For example, not all cities are experiencing population growth. In some parts of East Asia, for example, we are seeing a decrease in the population of first-tier cities. Is this an adjustment to new demographic and economic conditions? Will it drag down economic growth? Or is it a change that should be welcomed? In this year's conference on urban expansion and the future of cities, we want to investigate such questions. And this is because we want to find ways to make sure that urban population growth happens in ways that create economic growth, bring higher standards of living, and improve the environment. Now, since the inception of this conference, we have brought together policymakers and academics. We have been doing this because we want to understand the problems that policymakers are facing. We also want to hear the policy lessons they have learned and how we can support the policy ideas that they are proposing. At the same time, we want to identify the knowledge gaps that can be investigated by researchers. To stimulate more policy-relevant research, we launched last year as part of this conference a Young Urban Economist workshop. The workshop gives young researchers an opportunity to present their work and learn about the world of policy. You will also notice that there is a mix of policymakers and academics in every session of the conference, and this is not a coincidence. So in conclusion, we know that responding to the changes in the patterns of urban populations that are underway will not be easy. It will require a long-term vision, institutional capacity, sensible investments, and innovative ways to facilitate urbanization and manage urban economies. I wish I could listen and learn throughout the conference, but I'm confident that Harris and the organizers will make sure that the ideas and experiences discussed during the conference will be shared widely with those who cannot join you today. I wish you vigorous debates and new insights, and thank you very much for listening.
And it goes without saying that he does send his regrets. I think he would have liked to have been here in person. So without repeating the message from Intermit, I want to extend a few more thanks to the partnerships that made this conference possible. At the World Bank, the conference reflects a close collaboration between the research department, which I'm representing, the Development Economics Research Group, and the Urban Department, the Global Practice for Urban Resilience and Land that Bernice is representing here today. I'm very grateful to the staff from both teams who worked together tirelessly, as you can imagine, to make this event possible. I also want to acknowledge generous financial support from the Knowledge for Change program, from the World Bank's Territorial and Spatial Development Solutions Group, as well as from the Elliott School of International Affairs, the Institute for International Economic Policy, and the Center for International Business Education and Research, the last of which are all from the George Washington University. And we thought we had lots of departments. We're also very thankful for their support to the Millennium Challenge Corporation and to our partner for the last 4 editions of the conference, the International Growth Center, and in particular its Cities That Work program. So I'll hand over the floor to Jonathan Leap, who's the Executive Director of the International Growth Center, for his welcoming remarks. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much. Good morning. I'm Jonathan Leap. I'm the Executive Director of the International Growth Center. I'm delighted to add my words of welcome to this conference, and as Dion said, I think this is the 5th time running that we've had the privilege of co-hosting with the bank and with George Washington University, and it's great to be here. The event brings together policymakers, researchers, and practitioners for a series of discussions on issues critical to the future of cities, and with the aim of inspiring both new research and innovative policy solutions. This dual aim really epitomizes what the International Growth Center is all about. We're a global research center based in 11 countries across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East, and with a hub at the London School of Economics. Established in 2008 with the University of Oxford, the IGC combines an international network of academic researchers with long-term in-country partnerships with policymakers. Most of our programs, those partnerships are now reaching their 15th year. The objective of these partnerships is to produce demand-led academic research that generates new ideas, that generates robust evidence, and that feeds into new policy solutions to promote inclusive and sustainable growth. Running through all of IGC's research, not just in cities, but across all of our areas of research, is the core idea that it is improvements in the productivity of people and of businesses that drives economic development and growth. How to accelerate economic development is a big question that does not have a big answer. It has lots of little answers in the form of changes that help move people and resources from less productive to more productive activities. And such changes require good policies and sound governance as the ultimate drivers of productive jobs and sustainable prosperity. We're delighted to be collaborating in this year's conference and also to welcome the Millennium Challenge Corporation as the partner for this year and for the fresh insights that they brought to the program. The conference is a big event for us in part of our annual calendar and really quite a special opportunity to support the research policy dialogue that we feel is really at the center of good policy. We see it as an important opportunity to engage with urban policymakers and practitioners, both through our Cities That Work program, as Dion mentioned, but also our Cities Research program, which Ed chairs, and Nick Sivanides, who's also here with us, and Garrett Bryan run. I want to highlight 3 changes in this year's conference compared to previous years. First, in addition to the targeted invitations, we for the first time had an open call for papers. And we were very pleased with the response to that and look forward to continuing to expand our network of researchers in this way. The second is that in addition to policy workshops, which we have long had, we will this time have policy addresses from distinguished policymakers in the course of the conference. And then finally, we decided this year to invite submissions from people outside of economics, and particularly with a focus on geographers and urban planners and other urban scholars. We felt that with the focus on urban expansion and the future of cities, that was a broader discussion that would benefit from these additional viewpoints, even if the conference itself will remain economic focused going forward. Just a quick comment on the theme of this year's conference, which, as you know, is urban expansion and the future of cities. The theme was chosen out of a realization that following the experience of the pandemic, which fundamentally altered how we think about urban interaction, we need now to focus on how cities can look forward to the future. And at the core of this are 3 issues. One is how they expand, both physically with sprawl, but also with densification. The other is how they become more productive, and of course, labor markets are central here, but so too is technology. And then finally, how they become more resilient. We know cities going forward are going to face more shocks and more challenges, especially, of course, as a result of climate change. As I noted before and have mentioned, the overall aim of the conference is really to support this policy research dialogue. And just to be very explicit, what we mean by that is we want researchers to listen to policymakers, and we want policymakers to listen to researchers. And we think in this way, and we're hoping to promote that dialogue across a range of different areas, that we can both generate a better understanding of how academic research can help policymakers design and implement better policies. Research on its own, research on the research side, we know that research can provide robust evidence on what works and what doesn't, which makes policies more effective and often less costly. But research can also do a different thing, which is sometimes overlooked, which is it can provide new conceptual frameworks that allow us to reframe policy questions in a way that throws up new policy options. So if we can bring the 2 sides together in a sort of demand-led research process, then we can both support innovative policy and push the policy frontier, but in the process be generating exciting new ideas and evidence that push the academic, the scientific frontier. So those are our unambitious aims for the conference, is really to be pushing on both of those sides. Let me just say briefly that this isn't just rhetoric, that out of last year's conference, just to give you some examples, we have an ongoing study now in Accra with the regional minister of Accra on how solid waste management and chronic flooding are impacted by this new initiative, the GARID initiative, which I know the bank is supporting. With the mayor of Quelimane in northern Mozambique, we are implementing a study of how mangroves on the edge of the city can best be preserved for coastal defenses in the presence of a high degree of pressure from rural-urban migration in the city. And then finally, with the urban unit in Punjab, Pakistan, the director of which is here with us today, we've embedded researchers with their team to help look at data and understand spatial vulnerability. So a lot of things have come out of these conferences over the years, and we very much look forward to that happening again this time. For those of you who are particularly interested, either as researchers or policymakers, in generating new research projects, I strongly encourage you to attend the session tomorrow afternoon at 1:15, which is Connecting Policy, Projects, and Research, where we'll be doing just that. A quick final point from me. I'm happy to share the news that next year's conference will, for the first time, not be hosted here in the bank, but will instead be hosted in the city of Cape Town in June 2025. And very much look forward to seeing all of you there. We have someone from the city with us, Hugh, who you'll see later on today. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Bernice van Bronckhorst, who is the Global Director for Urban Resilience and Land Global Practice here at the bank and is chairing our opening session.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the welcome, and welcome everyone. Really, real pleasure to be here today and to be moderating this opening panel. I had the pleasure last year too. We had a really interesting discussion at the time, and I have no doubt it will be similarly exciting this morning. I believe we are still waiting on our fourth. There she is coming. I think she's in high demand and was asked to do an interview before she could join the panel. So without further ado, let me introduce then the other members of the panel whilst we wait for the Mayor of Freetown to join us on the stage. We are joined today, as Jonathan mentioned, it's a combination of policymakers and researchers, and the idea is very much to have that debate. Before I was a global director, I was actually urban practitioner for about 20 years, and I have to say the innovation that we brought in our projects, and sometimes the evidence that we could bring to policymakers to persuade them to take certain new directions, came from research. I mean, it's papers, publications, evidence that really helped us push the agenda. So, this interplay, this interaction between the research community and policymakers and practitioners on the ground is absolutely critical for us to be able to move this agenda forward. And, as Indermit said in his opening, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, if you just think of the challenges ahead, almost 1 billion new urban dwellers, in the next 3 decades. That's 25 years, actually, not even 3 decades. So that's just, we have to put sort of all hands on deck to really, figure out ways that we can support these countries. So, and again, I should not talk too much myself because I'm the moderator, but let me start by introducing then Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, who, and now I need my glasses because I can't read without, is the mayor of Freetown. And congratulations, I hear you were just re-elected recently for a 2nd term. And is also the co-chair of the C40. So we're really, really pleased to have you here with us today, Yvonne. Our second policymaker, as already mentioned by Jonathan, is Omar Masood, who is the chief executive of the urban unit at the Pakistan in Cities that Work Council member. And again, has decades of experience working on urban issues of course, in Pakistan. And then we have our 2 our research panelists. So we have Don Davis, who is the Ragnar Nursk Professor of Economics at Columbia University. So very pleased to have you here. And then we have our final panelist, but not last but not least, we have Macy Wong, who is the James Riady Associate Professor of Real Estate at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome, all 4 of you. The way we will do the debate, discussion, panel, is we've given all of the different panelists 3 questions, and we've asked them to prepare a few minutes of, what their thoughts on the particular questions are. They don't all need to answer all questions, but the idea is to see if we can get a little bit of a discussion going as well. So maybe we just jump straight in. Thank you. At the end, we'll have, hopefully, I know we're running a little bit behind time, but I'll try and keep a little bit of time for question and answers as well, so that we can have some participation from the audience. So I think it's supposed to be on the slides. I don't know who's manning the slides, but we'll start with our first question, which is, should governments intervene to stimulate urban growth and or prevent urban decline? And I will ask for a volunteer to go first. Omar, over to you.
Yeah, well, my answer is, number one, it was only last night that I came to know that we are also discussing urban decline, because for us, it's all about urban growth from my perspective in Pakistan. I mean, if you look at the urban growth numbers of intermediate cities, large cities, and even small towns, they're off the charts. But you know, you see pockets of urban decline within cities. I mean, the issue is that, do we have a choice between urban growth and urban decline? Right now, the only lever that we have is the urban growth lever. And why I would say that we do not have the urban decline lever is because from a bureaucratic point of view, and I belong to a bureaucracy, and we are rule-based bureaucracies. You know, I've discussed issues of revitalization and rehabilitation, and you know, bringing the old city centers back. And the practitioners on the ground always tell me that we don't have the rules for it. I mean, we agree with the idea, but we don't have the rules or the checklist on how do we go about doing things. We have rules for land use a lot. So how do you expand? How do you make a green area into a brown area? That's where we are very innovative and we are very creative. But I think it is like building the Noah's Ark before the flood comes. So, you know, it's really before urban decline starts to happen. It's not happening right now, because if you look at the demographics of a country like Pakistan, it's almost 60% under the age of 40. Cities are going to grow. You know, whether small or large, they are going to go in some fashion or another. And we need to understand this urban expansion more deeply. But at the same time, urban decline would happen perhaps because of deindustrialization of cities, or cities becoming uncompetitive because of a certain industrial sector or a service sector. And these are the things that we have not sort of forecasted, because we just don't have a framework on how to deal with, you know, urban decline. Right now, what we are trying to deal with is how to control urban growth. I mean, I'm not saying regulate urban growth, but how to control it in such a fashion that we achieve maximum productivity. Because as Jonathan said, the spatial part has been there for a long, long time. But the part about productivity and about resilience, I mean, these things have really come, as far as policymakers are concerned, in the last 20 years. Resilience is like last 7-8 years. You know, sometimes in meetings I have to explain to people what resilience is, and then they actually start you know, getting it. So, so the plate is being filled up, but whether we have the appetite right now or, you know, that is a fundamental question. I stop here and let others pitch in. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Who would like to go next? Macy?
Thank you very much for having me. Before I go in, and respond, I just also wanted to just thank you for organizing this, because I think as a first-year graduate student with no goals and no aims, but a lot of energy, my advisor at MIT said, why don't you go to the World Bank and meet policymakers and learn what are the interesting problems out there? And so I think this mix of practitioners and researchers is absolutely really helpful. So thank you for organizing this. I think to the question of should governments intervene to stimulate urban growth or prevent urban decline, I think, yes, I think it depends on the context and your goals, but I think given the numbers you said, I think for a lot of cities, it's about the growth. And I think people come to cities in search of to be productive, to have a good quality of life, however you define it, And I think when you put a lot of people together, there can be positive interactions and negative interactions. And I think there needs to be spillovers, and I think there needs to be some rule of law, some processes, coordination to promote positive interactions and manage negative interactions. So I think absolutely there's a role for this. I think while we are seeing a lot of growth, and that's the immediate problem at hand, I think because some of this infrastructure allocation, and this is all a lot of this capital is durable, I think thinking ahead and planning ahead, and it's useful to worry about urban decline, and there are cities that are declining where then policies can intervene to arrest any downward spiral. But I think that's more something you should consider in planning, but I think there's definitely a role for it.
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Don.
So I'm very excited to be here. I started my life in academia as an international trade economist. And my sense in the international economics world was that policies were always within shouting distance of first best. In urban stuff, nothing anywhere, I think, is really near first best. And so, but I think that from a policy perspective, that makes it a really exciting place to be working. So I think that when we think about growth or when we think about decline, that the specifics really matter of the particular countries that we're thinking about. And if we were to look, for example, at sort of the path that China's gone on, from 1990 forward, there's been a spectacular urbanization, of course in a very different setting than other places because they have the hookah system on regulating mobility. India, obviously has had growth. Also, they have very large cities, but they look really different in the path that they've taken. What does that tell us about what opportunities did or didn't exist? Why do you have different outcomes? In China, they're certainly thinking about ongoing, very great magnitudes of growth. But they're also, things are much more restricted in terms of moving into the largest cities. And there's, this real question, what is the knowledge base on which, we're building this? If you are going to regulate the size of cities, should it be just an aggregate thing? Should it be about the composition? And again, I feel like our knowledge base, so it's wonderful that there's so much new work happening with developing country cities, but it still seems very thin to me at the moment. So we know in general that cities serve as a matter of stability from theory tend to be oversized, because if they weren't, then people would be moving into the ones where actually they're sort of accelerating gains. Something that seems underexplored, though, and might be interesting to look at in the Chinese case, where they actually do more directly regulate things, is even if sort of individually the returns have to be on the declining side in the cities, what about the composition? And is there a big trade-off between, in some sense, the congestion costs of cities may be roughly equal or even greater for the less skilled relative to the more skilled. The potential benefits in sort of, how would you say it, in aggregate terms or nominal terms is going to be larger for the more skilled, but it may be a trade-off in terms of equity. And I think also in terms of, last point that I'll say, which is in terms of rural-urban migration, we do have experimental evidence that there are, quite significant gains, and that the gains seem to be more than just there must be some amenities about living in the countryside. There seems to be some lack of capability that's there, or lack of knowledge about what the opportunities are. And there are a number of experiments, including like in the Moving to Opportunity in the United States, where these small information frictions seem to, for people who have trouble getting information, really change their lives or limit their lives in very significant ways. So I have more things to say, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yvonne, did you want to?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. So I thought it'd be helpful. Thank you. I thought it'd be helpful for us to actually, for a moment, just stop and say, what do we mean by urban growth? Are we talking about population size, or are we talking about economic growth? To use Freetown as an example, my short answer to the question is yes. And then in terms of yes, I do think government should intervene, but I would phrase it a bit differently. We're seeing in Freetown growth, population size growth, so urbanization in terms of more people. And that's been driven by rural urban migration, which had a historical start with the war period, but now has been accelerated with climate impacts on rural communities that are largely subsistence farmers. But we're also seeing an organic growth because we see in our cities very young population. About 70% of our population in Freetown is under the age of 35. So that means growth, that means more children because these are the young people. So that physical growth is happening, that population size is happening. And that doesn't need stimulation. If anything, it needs potentially some control because of the second bit, which is, has that urban growth in size led to economic growth? And the answer is no. So you see a decline because growth has not been properly managed. And where does government come in? Government comes in terms of land use planning, in terms of land tenure, in terms of housing availability, in terms of transport networks, in terms of service delivery, in order for that increased population size to be more economically productive. So you don't need government help for the population to grow, but you certainly do need government's support for that enabling environment to be present, to allow that growth of humanity to translate into an improvement in the lives of those living in the city. And we haven't seen that. We have seen, in many cases, vulnerable people moving and being more vulnerable within the context of that urbanization because of the lack of resilience, because it's led to deforestation, and it's led to landslides and mudslides, because it's led to the proliferation of informal settlements. So the question, I think, can be unpacked to say, my answer, there's a role for government. There's a role for government to ensure that urbanization leads to economic productivity.
Great, thank you. Thank you, great set of answers. And I mean, one of the big takeaways, of course, is that it is always completely context specific, right? It's very difficult to draw these very, big generalizations. And in terms of the declining cities, I guess we've been talking a lot about sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, for example, but we're seeing some regions of the world where there's big issues around aging, right, and sort of shrinking urban populations, like some of the Eastern Europe, Central Asia, etc. Anyway, that's a separate debate. But what is interesting, I think there is often a big emphasis on the mega cities, the free towns. But what is also interesting is really to look at, are the challenges and opportunities of rapid urban growth the same for primary cities and secondary cities? And should we perhaps do something different, or do they go hand in hand, or what is the system of cities that we're looking at? So I don't know if anyone wants to go first on that one.
Yeah, if
Omar.
I can respond to this quandary about secondary and primary cities. I mean, it's been there for a long, long time, We need to change the word secondary, because if you're secondary, you will always remain secondary. Let's talk about as a city. So it is a city, it is a smaller city, but it is a city nevertheless. But, the issue is how your local government is structured. That matters a lot. Because if you overlay it with the secondary and primary city and system of cities sort of debate and discussion that the keynote would be looking at separately shortly, it's very difficult to juxtapose it, because local government says, this is my city. So if the mayor of Lahore would say, I am the mayor of Lahore and I do not need Sheikhupura, which is 40 kilometers away, or Gujranwala, which is 60 kilometers away, very large size cities to be I don't want to be part of any system. So, the primary city would sort of elbow out the secondary city. They would, even if it is a regional approach or a system of cities approach, they would then need to have the entire control. I'm talking about the politics of it. And the politics of cities, mind you, in the developing countries is now becoming very, very relevant. Previously, if you are talking about parliamentary system, a majority of elected members used to return from rural constituencies. But now as cities are expanding and population are growing within cities and constituencies are based on population, you have a larger urban representation in parliamentary politics. And that is a new dynamic which is emerging in the developing world in the last 20, 25 years, or at least in Pakistan. So, I'm giving you an example as a policymaker. When I came here for this conference, I have to request leave from the government. So I went to my chief secretary and I said, the new chief minister has taken over. Perhaps I should not go, and she might ask for a presentation from the urban unit. And the chief secretary said, don't worry, she's just too busy with the new things. You'll come far down the road, perhaps in the 3rd month. And the moment I landed, I received a call that she's asking for a presentation from the urban unit. I sort of requested her to postpone it for a week so I can actually return after attending this conference much more well-informed than I was before I left for this conference. But this is becoming very, very important. And the debate about secondary cities is going to come to fore. Whether we like it or not, it is going to come to fore, is because one thing that has happened, and again I'm giving the example of Pakistan, the connectivity between secondary and primary cities has really improved. So, whether we see it or not, cities are already operating under some sort of an informal system framework. We don't realize it, but cities are. The entrepreneurs and the firms are looking at themselves as part of a framework of cities. Whether our laws or our local government laws are still not recognizing it, that's a separate question. And I think they will need to actually catch up with it. That's all on my part. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Omar. Who would like to come in next? We don't have to go in the same order. Okay, Yvonne, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I actually just wanted to pick up on what Omar just said about the fact that there's an informal connectivity between cities. And I also just wanted to, I just put a note down because Freetown is not a mega city in the way that mega cities are defined. Our population is 1.2, 1.5 million people. So it's, for me, this question of primary, secondary cities, it's a question of size and it's a question of evolution, because what is today a secondary city will become a primary city as it continues to grow. And sometimes these terminologies are kind of used by research, by policymakers for convenience, but means very little to those who are actually living in these spaces. I think it also, as you said, Omar, it's also helpful to not relegate someone to a secondary status because you kind of feel like you're being undervalued. What I would say in terms of the role of local and national governments in terms of the challenges is that it's true whether it's a primary city or secondary city. It's true whether it's a small city or a big city. Ultimately, local governments are closest to the residents. They're closest to the challenges. They're therefore closer to the solutions. And part of the difficulty that we've certainly seen, and from what Omar is saying, in Pakistan is that potentially local governments have not had the mandates and the functions and the authority that they require in order to be more effective. So as we look at this growth, I would actually rephrase again, doing a little rephrasing here. The primary and secondary, I'll just go big and small, medium, and what do they need? Pretty much the same thing. And in terms of connectivity, we're finding, I'm finding with my colleagues that it makes sense for me to encourage and support colleagues from other cities, mayors in Port Loko, mayors in McKinney, because it is their residents, rather than have their residents leave their neighborhoods and come to Freetown, let's support the mayor in those cities so that they have opportunities, so that their urbanization is fed by those closest to them, as opposed to having a situation where people feel they need to make the journey to the capital city. Mayors' networks, local government authority networks, these are all helpful platforms where information is shared, peer learning happens, and as you mentioned, in terms of our residents, whether, for those who are businesses, those who are students, they just see us as different locations. They don't see us in that sort of policy framework. So how do we make the lives of those who live in our cities better through our own connections and support networks? And I think there's more and more of that happening with networks like, UCLG, C40 Cities, and others, where in our combined efforts to address the climate crisis, to address gender, to address poverty, we are coming together as peers and looking at solutions, which sometimes mean we're going to apply for funding together. We're working together. So the challenges and opportunities for growth, I feel they're very similar. There's obviously more pressure, ultimately on the bigger cities. We all have a role to play. The biggest role I think national governments can play is to support local governments to get the work done.
Great, thanks. Great argument. And let's, from now on, in the conference, call them small, medium, and large cities. Maybe we can move away from the, the value judgment on primary and secondary. Very good. Who would like to come in?
Yeah,
Don, go ahead.
I'm going to stick to the prior language. I love the new language, but I can't speak it that quickly. So a foundational question is, how do large and small cities differ? Is a large city just an overgrown small city? And the answer, of course, is no. I've done research both for the United States, but also looking in work with Jonathan Dingle on Brazil, China, and India. And one of the sort of foundational differences between large and small cities is that they have different skill compositions, that the large cities are more skilled than smaller cities. And, we had looked at this in the US, we were very curious about Brazil, China, and India, and it's very true there. And along with the differences in skill composition, there's going to be a difference in the kind of jobs that are available, the kinds of industries that are available in the different places. And that also means, along with it, that the sort of tasks of the city are different. Large cities tend to be larger more or less in everything, and to have sort of a superset both of the activities, the economic activities, but also the kinds of people that you're going to find there. That there are people, there'll be a significant number of people that are, in jobs in the largest city, that there really is no other place that would be appropriate for them to work, because they're really at the peak of the pyramid. And so I think that when we start thinking about both the challenges of some of the largest cities, especially in the developing world, are spectacular. And we have these kind of questions that we have to grapple with, which is, should we sort of discourage, further investment there? Because we understand that the congestion costs are tremendous. Maybe we should direct resources relatively much more toward medium-sized cities or something like that. Those are very practical questions. And again, we get into the issue that both the costs are, in some sense, on the face, much greater there, but the benefits may be greater also. And until we really have the knowledge base to be able to answer the balance between those, again, in specific contexts, I think it's going to be a hard thing to do. So I know that it's cheap for an academic to say, we need further research, but I actually think in this case that it's true.
All right, further research.
Yes.
Macy.
I want to echo, I think, coming with this framework of population growth versus economic growth, which people are coming in, and I think if you ask my young students and younger people, they the educated, they all want to go to really big cities. And I think, but sometimes when they go to those cities, they realize it's very expensive, it's very complicated, and then they figure it out. So I think this idea of like, we want to have big, medium, small cities, and I think from the practitioner's point of view, I think they are just trying to figure out, for my city, when people and firms come and entrepreneurs come, how can I help them be more productive? How can I help them create jobs? How can I help them climb up the job ladder? I think the principles there are the same. It's just maybe the capacity of the government might be different. The scale of the problem is different. And so how we do that might be different, but I think the principles are the same. To the point of the national versus local and the politics of it, I am very sympathetic to it. I would just bring up that I think what's important is to recognize that it is a system of cities. And I think we want to make sure that there's no zero-sum competition going on to the extent possible, but the politics is always very difficult. And I think that's where some of the national versus local comes in to play.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have one final question, and then after that we'll have some, we'll open it up to the audience. So, final question, and this is, I think, a little bit driven by our new president, who has a big, a lot of emphasis, big drive on technology and how we can harness technology to accelerate, development outcomes for the countries that we work in. So how will developing country cities be affected by technological change? How do you see that?
I think it's a huge opportunity. We've, just as you mentioned, I've recently been re-elected in my first term, and I'll be talking about that in the policy statement. Transform Freetown had innovation and technology as an underpinning sort of enabler. And there are lots of practical examples I can give you. We were able to use technology to reform our property rate system and digitize it, which enabled us to increase property tax revenue 5-fold in the course of a year. Revenue potential, I hasten to add, compliance is another thing altogether. We have a tree tracker app, which has enabled us to plant. Our target was 1 million trees. We're at 977,000, but every tree is geolocated. Every tree you go, I can give you the tracker. You click on it, you will come down and see the tree. It builds confidence. It means we're able to pay young people based on work that we can see being monitored. We pay them with mobile money. We're doing a waste system. We previously had Find Me in Freetown, which is an app which enables you to find where waste providers are, and it shows where you are, so you're matching them. We've advanced on that, and we're going to have something that enables scheduling. So technology is allowing us to do so much more than anyone would previously have done. And as we come into my second term, we are taking this technology to a different level, in as much as and I'll talk about that, I won't preempt my policy statement, but we really are seeing the opportunity for that economic growth that I mentioned linked to technology. So in short, will developing countries, cities be affected by technological change? Absolutely. And it's a positive impact if we are allowed to harness, which comes up with issues around the cost of internet connectivity and so forth. But those are very important, but still do not stop us from being able to harness positive impacts.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Wonderful examples. But though, I guess the question is also a little bit like, what if you don't? Are you going to be left behind, right? As technology evolves very rapidly. So who else would like to come in? Omar.
I think, if you look at cities, and again, coming to the Pakistani example, I talked about that cities comprise, or younger population comprise a very large portion of cities. So regardless of income groups, they are very tech savvy. So the population of large cities, even if they are unplanned and haphazardly planned and infrastructure is creaking otherwise, the population is now very well connected. So it is a very responsive population. And I think because of the smartphone, this responsiveness in the population has sort of made all politicians introspect and look at the fact that, technology is now really a serious opportunity and a threat for them as far as their role in the cities is concerned. Whether as mayors or as future prime ministers or chief ministers, this is becoming very important. And as the political leadership also becomes more younger, so, there is a sort of a movement towards, technology. But I would sort of like to add something more to it, that, it's not like let 1,000 flowers bloom sort of an approach, that something good is going to come out of it just like that. We in Lahore get a lot of digital exhaust from applications, whether they are government or private, but we are not putting them to use or trying to put them to use creatively or strategically for the city. So what we would really demand and what we would really request is that we need to build urban data infrastructure for cities in developing countries. That is a very, very important thing, because this is the new platform. So, all evidence should come from an urban data infrastructure through which you can, figure out what is the city, what are the requirements of the city, what are the citizens looking at. There would be tighter feedback loops and everything else, but how do you actually sort of, crystallize this thing into some sort of a policy action? I want to go beyond the wow effect of technology, in the sense that, for example, let me give you an example. Land registration was made digital in 2017. We never used it. So it was digital and transactions were happening. It was only when the World Bank came with the affordable housing program and they wanted housing data on housing units, it's only then we started using that e-registry. And then we did this sort of drilling down of analysis, and then we came up what is the average size of the housing unit, what is the average price that they are contracting at, the interquartile range, the maximum minimum. And it was so path-breaking. It is so path-breaking. It looks very simple from a statistical point of view, but in the policy world, this can change cities in a fundamental way. So please help us build that data infrastructure. We are ready to go. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Macy?
Yep. I guess we self-select and we're positive people, and so we're on the panel, and we think all technology is all great, and I echo that. I think technology lowers the cost, gives us more flexibility, allows us to share ideas, lowers the cost of creating business. I think a lot of young people are also entrepreneurs, and promotes financial inclusion. I think that's all good. I think some of the discussion about technological change is about how the shocks are so large, and if some of the infrastructure that we're building is durable, how are we thinking about anticipating those shocks? And I think there, I'll do what Don said, which is I think the evidence is still, the base is thin, but it's growing. And so when I prepared for this question, I went to the World Bank, the IGC, to learn about how different cities are handling this, and then using data to improve our planning and thinking ahead. That definitely is very helpful. And then I would just say also that cities have survived many shocks. And when you put a lot of enterprising people together and you allow them to thrive in cities, we will be able to find ideas around big problems. And I think that's what I would end with.
Let me touch on two disparate things. One is to echo what Omar was saying about the new availability of data. So I spent some time in Mexico City this summer and talked to people at the Banco de Mexico And then we actually, as a result of that, this Monday, we had a group of graduate students, PhD students at Columbia that were gathered to be briefed on how you could get availability to that data. And it's typically through collaborations with people at the bank. But, and the bank there, of course, only has one segment of the types of data. I also talked to people at the Ministry of Mobility. They have terabytes of data, and they don't have sort of the people that really can spend time to extract meaning from that might affect policies. So certainly trying to get the infrastructure and trying to get sort of the collaborations certainly, from our side, the PhD students are extraordinarily interested in finding a way to do these kinds of things. They care about the issues. They have all of the techniques. There are people in country typically that are going to know sort of modern techniques. And I think that we can go a long way towards more knowledge base. And obviously there are people who are already on this path, but certainly if we can do more. The other thing, so it's how will developing countries be affected by technological change? Sort of a big question. So I just wanted to take one little piece of it, and to a certain extent, thinking back to work in international, we've had sort of a long period of globalization of things, that we offshore things. And we know we're here today. Why do we bother gathering? Why aren't we on Zoom? Of course, the answer is Zoom is not the same thing yet as face-to-face. And there's a question of whether it ever will be, and there are experiments going on. So certainly as a result of COVID, we have sort of a lot more, certainly in the United States and I think in other places, work from home. And obviously the separation of work and residence is something that's really important. And one of the things, so there's sort of a static efficiency question. Do you lose a lot of productivity when you work from home as to not work, as to working in the office? And at least for many things, the answer is no, and sometimes that there's actually a positive benefit. Obviously not everything. But there's a separate question. From work from home, you're typically still living in the same metro area. You're still going in at some frequency into the office. And there's a question that is being pressed within the tech world and other places, which is sort of a work from anywhere. And I sort of feel that obviously at the individual level, they can be near the ski slopes in Detroit and still be in Silicon Valley and get Silicon Valley wages for their job. But in some sense, they better hope that, from their own perspective, that actually really doesn't work at all. Because if that works, what's to keep it from crossing borders? Yes. And so one of the things, the world, everywhere, is awash with extremely capable, smart, talented people. They don't always have the same kinds of opportunities, but in some sense, part of what the community in the major developed countries, if you're very skilled, the premium that you get is monopoly access to the centers where this is happening. And we have restrictions on visas into the United States, even for extremely skilled workers, and that protects at least some of that premium. What if, so again, we're here today because we're not there, with Zoom, we're not there yet. But what if we overcome more of that? And we've been asking these kinds of questions, since, mail and the telegraph and the phone and the fax and so on. So I don't know how quickly we'll get there. But in a world awash with extremely talented, smart people, capable people, how long can it be till that monopoly access to these centers begins to erode? And I think that, again, this is sort of projecting out, I don't know how far, because like a lot of things, the crisis or the change takes a really long time to get there and then happens faster than you can possibly imagine. I think that's Rudy Dornbush saying that. But I do wonder whether, the short run impact, if if you're in Buenos Aires or you're in some other place, and suddenly you can participate in, seriously in Silicon Valley rather than being excluded, whether that's going to give rise in a very short run to tremendous amounts of additional inequality within cities and within countries. But one can imagine that prosperity, if it really does bring in resources, could also spill over to others, but that's a longer process. So I'll stop there.
Yes, go ahead. And I just was thinking, if you believe the right-wing American newspapers, San Francisco is in trouble, right? Because, people working from home all over the country and companies pulling out. So maybe that's the direction you're going. Yvonne, go ahead. And then if people want to start thinking of questions that they might want to ask us, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience as well.
So I just wanted to come back on the point Don just made about resource and inequality. And you gave us the example of the individual and the opportunities for the individual in terms of using technology for personal benefit. But I wanted to just, since this is policy and research and it's at the World Bank, and we're thinking about, how can real difference be made? I wanted to just pick up on the fact that some quite simple technologies can be leveraged to points which are quite transformative, and that it's worth having that in mind in terms of policy decisions, in terms of where investments are happening. And I've just used this example of what we did with the property reform in Freetown, where through moving from a paper database, if you can call a paper book a database, of 37,000 properties, we were able to digitize by using a satellite image of the city, and then doing roof line measurements, ground truthing. We did this work with IGC, and Abubakar is here. I would not, I'd be failing if I didn't acknowledge him and say thank you for that partnership. It was funded by FCDO. But we ended up with over now 120,000 properties on our books. But most significantly, we have the plus codes of each property. We have the geolocations, the latitude and longitude. What does that mean? It means that, and we obviously have property values assigned. It means that now we can introduce a comprehensive waste management system where we can choose to categorize our properties in 3 bands. That's what we've chosen to do. Those who pay below 500, those who pay between 500 and 2 million, those who pay over 2 million leones. And all of a sudden, we now have the ability to apply consistent sanitation charges from the city to residents, which is phenomenal from the perspective of improving waste collection. At the same time, the city hasn't had a postal system in decades. With the Google Plus codes, we can introduce postcodes. So one investment in technology, which frankly costs about $1.2 million, drop in the ocean when you think about the billions that we talk about when we talk about technology, has been revolutionary for one city and for the lives of many of its residents. So as we ask this question, let's be practical and think about how the right investments can be made, which are not massive, but if well thought through and well implemented, can be transformative for many, many cities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that incredibly powerful example, and I think Omar also spoke to that. No, this sort of city data infrastructure is really at the foundation of a lot of this. Let me invite people to come to the microphones in the room. If there's anyone that has a question for anyone on the panel, maybe introduce yourselves and say who the question is for, or if it's for the entire panel. Thank you.
Is this on? Hi, I'm Monica Bansel. I lead the Green Cities Division at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I wanted to just first say that example of the property value system is so inspiring. It's something that I'm really resonated with me, and I think we're often looking for these silver bullets, and there aren't any, but that sounds like that sounds like as close as maybe we could get. Mayor Akisor, you also mentioned for question number 2, you talked about very briefly, the role of the national government giving all of the authorities and the resources that cities need to be able to fulfill this mandate that they have, where they're the closest to the people, they can see what the demands are, they know what the solutions are. I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit more. And also, just coming from a donor perspective, if you could also shed some light on what the international community could do more of to help with these governance issues that are, you know, at the crux of so many of the challenges that developing cities face. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We can take a few more questions if anyone else. Yeah.
My name is Kala Sridhar. I am a professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore, India. And this was an excellent panel. Thanks a lot. And my question, I think, is directed to the mayor of Freetown. And I really enjoyed the points that she made at various points in the discussion. I wanted to just understand this from an Indian perspective. In India, there is a democratically elected mayor for every city, like you are. You represent the people of Freetown, right? But we also have an executive council, which is actually answerable to the state government. And the mayor, like you, is answerable to the citizens who elected them. So there is some inherent conflict, the way in which the city governance happens, because the executive wings seems to be bothered always with budgets and the constraints they have in the bureaucracy, whereas the mayor always seems to think that they represent the public, and this area of the city is neglected in terms of public services and so forth. So how do you reconcile this in the context of city like Freetown, or more generally like other cities in Sierra Leone? And I would really like to appreciate the point made by Professor Davis on the need for a data infrastructure, because tomorrow evening I'll present a paper, and that's about Indian cities, but unfortunately data is based from the global human settlements layer, which is put out of the Joint Commission for Europe. So can we have more authentic and local recent data sources? So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have one more, and then we...
Hello, my name is Ron Basmalik. I'm a big data software engineer. I'm looking for researchers or institutions to kind of partner with as a pro bono technical resource. And my question was kind of on how do you think about the role of governments as platforms for facilitating interchange and kind of solving problems versus actually going in and delivering goods and services themselves. For example, with a lot of the, like real estate data, for example, in the developing world, in a lot of these kind of booming cities, do you see the role of the government to actually go in and start building housing, or use and release the data more as kind of a platform for private actors to do so? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think we have a few questions specifically for the mayor, and then I think maybe this last question, which is for everyone. So over to you, Yvonne.
USID, the first question, to unpack what I meant. So their urban management tools, building permits, land use planning. In most parts of the world, these are functions which are devolved to local governments. In Sierra Leone, it's devolved on paper, it's not devolved in practice. So literally, there is no planning done by the city. Someone can be building a house, an apartment building in the middle of the city, we would have no idea. And as you can well imagine, that has implications for service delivery, and I'll be talking more about that. So that's what I mean, but you'll hear more about that in the policy statement. What can the international community do? I will touch on that. When you look at this from a green perspective, and I'm glad you mentioned green cities, building control is clearly one of the tools that can be used in managing environmental degradation. There is, I think, a real opportunity for nation states to be held accountable to the policies that they implement, to the way in which they are engaging with things like environmental degradation when it comes to donor funding. You know, how are we seeing climate commitments and the implementation of climate commitments, your NDCs, NDCs or NCDs, NDCs? How are you seeing those feeding into, and even on a more practical level, on a country-by-country specific basis, where you see those gaps, where you see those bottlenecks, are you still just giving the funding irrespective? Or are you actually linking funding disbursements to environmental issues and to local government decentralization, devolution, and empowerment? So I think there's scope for work to be done there. In respect of India and your setup with the elected mayor and then the executive council, what we have is an elected council. So the mayor is elected by universal suffrage. Everybody in the city eligible to vote votes for the mayor. But at the ward level, you vote for councillors. So the mayor and the council sit together. In terms of central government, bizarrely, and again, this is not what the Act says, but this is what happens in practice, the executive, the core management team of the local government is hired by the central government and is paid by the central government. So you have a situation where if you're from one political party, you could have your whole management team from a different political party, and that makes for interesting work. And we also very recently, in my first term, having never had this before because we've had mayors since 1893 in Freetown. Freetown's an old city, 1792 it was founded. For the first time during my administration, the government appointed and created a new position, the Western Area Regional Minister. So there's now a minister with regional responsibility for the capital city. So in practical terms, you will always have those differences of priority, differences of viewpoints. I think what I've come to understand is that in order to do the best for your residents, you've got to find ways to collaborate. You've got to find ways to work together.
Absolutely. I would like to answer the last question, the one which said that what if instead of the government actually getting into data science, if they were to collaborate with outside agencies? I could not agree more with you. I have tried on my own sort of to procure or to get expertise within the government to do what data scientists do, but I think I've come to the conclusion that it's better that if we were to outsource it. Now the problem over here is another very fundamental one, is data should be a public good. I fundamentally believe that data should be a public good. But the type of data which I'm talking about is still being guarded in silos, and very jealously so, because that is an existential problem for the urban unit even. So today, if the urban unit, at a click of a button, were to make all its shapefiles public, nobody is going to come to the urban unit the next day. The phones are going to stop ringing. And I'll be out of a job. That is one thing that I always dread. But fundamentally speaking, what you are saying is true. Now the issue in government is we don't have that interface. We have not actually legally developed that interface. And that's why this issue about a data infrastructure was raised. So infrastructure, like road, is a public good, and you have certain laws that anybody can travel on a road. You do not need a permit to travel on, well, you need a toll, but you do not need a permission to actually travel on a road. So this type of interface has to be really developed, because I don't see the government actually doing these things, very smartly. If I were to start hiring, or if the government were to start hiring this talent, or to start engaging this talent, it would take more time. It's tedious. Government employments are not very competitive also. And I know data science people are fickle, in the sense they move from one place to another where the greatest challenge is. And that is something that we have to acknowledge. And that is something that we have not yet addressed, frankly speaking. So it's a fair question.
Macy.
Can I add to that? Because I feel I live with this data and gathering data and collecting data a lot in developing countries. And I work with the US data too, and it is very different. And I think that my own experience is that, or maybe coming back to what is data for? It is a public good, I think. And we want to make it apparent that this data is available for you to understand the city that you're living in. And when I live in a city as a resident, I care about my schools, where my schools are, where the hospitals are, where the infrastructure is. And it would be nice to see all of that in one map. But when I try to get the data, I have to go to the Ministry of Education. They own the data on schooling. To go to the Ministry of Public Works, and that there is a sense of this silo is I think, changing very rapidly, and I think this idea of allowing it to be geo-referenced and having the granularity would be incredibly important, because otherwise it's really hard to merge the data. So I think this technology of having geo-referencing and high-resolution data would be very helpful. And then the last thing I would end with all this data, I think it's also useful to have better modeling to try and understand how to use the data and how it all comes together in a city. And that is just to tee up some of the sessions tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. Data here, especially PhD students, tremendous number of potential researchers who would love to have access to the data, try and answer questions that are important for the people in the places that the data is from. And it's a struggle to match those up. And so if we could find paths forward on that, that would be wonderful.
Great. I think I have to wrap it up. I understand that we have 2 minutes till a coffee break, and then you all have to be back at 10:45, I believe, for the next session. But just really to say, first of all, thank you so much to the panel. I think it was really very interesting, quite wide-ranging discussion of the different topics that we're looking at. I know there were more questions in the audience, but I think there will be around, and there will be many other sessions over the next couple of days, so you'll have a chance to talk to them. I have to say, it's really interesting, this final topic, about data, digitalization, technology. I think the World Bank, I would say, speaking for the bank side, we've probably been a little bit sort of laggards on that front, and it's only in the last few years that we're trying to catch up fast. But it's absolutely fascinating, and a lot of opportunity there for all of us. So again, thanks everyone. Back in about 10 minutes at 10:45 for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.